Good afternoon. My name is Robert Lustig, and I'm an endocrinologist who does a little neuroscience on the side.
And I'm Dale Bredesen, and I'm a neurologist who does a little endocrinology on the side.
And we are here to discuss the commonalities of the work that we both do, and in fact the commonalities of the books that we both wrote at about the same time with the same publisher. Mine, The Hacking of the American Mind, the science behind the corporate takeover of our bodies and brains.
And mine is The End of Alzheimer's, the first program to prevent and reverse cognitive decline.
And we owe a lot to Morrison Forster for hosting us today. We owe a lot to Wolfram Alderson, our social media director, who's helping us post this Facebook Live chat. And we also owe a tremendous debt to Penguin Random House, specifically Avery Press and Carolyn Sutton, our publisher, for believing in both of us.
Yes, thank you, Carolyn.
You bet. Well, as I went through your book, The End of Alzheimer's, I basically thought that you had stolen my manuscript. And the level of commonality is really quite remarkable between the phenomenon of dementia and the phenomenon of metabolic syndrome that I describe here in my book.
Thanks. And as I went through Fat Chance especially, I was very excited to see that what you're talking about early in life and seeing these diseases earlier and earlier in life, very much like the diseases we are seeing later in life. And so that's why when you and I were asked to talk next summer together, I said, this is pediatric gerontology, and that I'm not kidding about that, because that is the way we're starting to see that these diseases begin much younger than they used to.
Indeed. I went into pediatrics to stay away from chronic disease, and now that's all I do. And children now get two diseases of aging that we had never seen before, type 2 diabetes and fatty liver disease. These were the diseases of aging, or they were the diseases of alcohol. And kids don't drink alcohol, so there's a clear problem.
This is a really good point. And chronic complex illnesses are really changing the way we think about medicine in general. Of course, we were taught in medical school that you get the diagnosis, and 20th century medicine was all about what? What is the diagnosis? Is it measles? Is it a broken leg? Is it heart failure? What is it? And then when you find out what it is, you get the appropriate prescription or surgery or what have you, and you essentially use a monotherapeutic approach. 21st century medicine must change, and unfortunately that's not being taught enough in the medical schools yet. We need to be able to look at much larger data sets and change the complexity gap, this huge gap between the complexity of the human organism and the simplicity of these data sets that we gather.
Before we started, we were actually talking about our alma maters. Right? You went to Caltech, I went to MIT. And what I said is that MIT, they taught you how to think, how to take complex problems, and certainly these chronic diseases are about as complex a problem as we have, break it down into its component parts, solve each one, and then build it back up. And I would say that, The End of Alzheimer's does that extraordinarily well in terms of understanding the different things that go into the issue of the loss of synapses that leads to Alzheimer's.
Right, and very much as you see with so many of these other chronic illnesses, what we find is a physiological balance. In this case, there is a whole set of signals that are synaptoblastic, that are helping you to form signals, literally memory forming and maintaining. And then on the other hand, a whole set of signals that are synaptoclastic. So just as you would get osteoporosis when your osteoblastic to osteoclastic ratio is out of whack, you can get synaptoporosis or Alzheimer's disease when that ratio is out of whack. So of course, you've got to measure all the different pieces if you're going to know where somebody is on that balance.
Right. Well, one of the things that I talk about in this book, Hacking the American Mind, are two neurotransmitters that have a reciprocal connection between each other. That is dopamine and serotonin. Dopamine being the pleasure neurotransmitter, serotonin being the contentment or happiness neurotransmitter, if you will. And, sadly for us, they have a reciprocal relationship that when dopamine tends to go up, serotonin tends to go down. But there's one thing that drives both of them in the exact wrong direction, and it's also driving synaptogenesis in the exact wrong direction too, and that is stress.
Right.
And I think stress is sort of at the basis of a lot of what we see in chronic disease today, whether it be brain, whether it be liver, whether it be heart. There's a tremendous amount of data that supports the role of stress and the importance of stress reduction, which you certainly go into, and I think I do too.
Yeah, and of course, if you look at just cortisol yourself, and for example, Robert Sapolsky's work over the years, very, very nice work, just what cortisol does to your brain and to your hippocampus. And interestingly, also CRF1 receptor has been implicated in Alzheimer's disease, and things that inhibit it actually have a positive impact on Alzheimer's pathophysiology.
Right.
So do you think when you look at the stress response, does it go beyond that? What are the other things that you worry about in that response?
Well, so from my standpoint, I think there are three things that are a problem in terms of stress. Number one, of course, is the production of cortisol, which then has not just brain actions, but peripheral actions driving this phenomenon we call insulin resistance, which appears to be at the base of virtually every chronic disease that we know today. The second thing is the activation of the sympathetic nervous system because of, sort of hyping yourself up, because after all, that is the stress response. There's just the acute stress response, there's the chronic stress response. Just because the chronic stress response starts moving with cortisol doesn't mean the acute stress response goes down. That's why blood pressure, tends to stay high. And then the last thing, which I get into in my book, is the prefrontal cortex, that part of your brain right here in the front, which I call the Jiminy Cricket of your brain. Basically, it's the part of your brain that keeps you from doing stupid things. Right. And when you are stressed, basically it's like turning the switch for Jiminy off.
Yeah. And
you tend to do really stupid things. Whether it's, jumping off a roof or whether it's, jumping into a half gallon of Dreyer's ice cream.
Or Las Vegas, or starting fires,
right.
So forth and so on. So
right.
we've unfortunately had a lot of these stupid things recently, unfortunately.
Indeed. So, I see stress as sort of a, common theme, underlying both our work in
right.
terms of ways to deal with it. So, what do you suggest doing about our, shall we say, our 24/7, 365, constant stress all the time society? How does one deal with that?
Yeah, it's a really good point, and as you pointed out, we're not being helped by the people who are trying to sell us processed foods and things like this. And unfortunately, this is a stressful lifestyle that we're all leading. That's part of what competition is all about, and the Western lifestyle. So I think that the reality is we have to understand, just as you go back to the 1980s, people started to realize, hey, wait a minute, we should all be exercising, we should all be running. It was a big change. Let's get physical was a big song of that era. Then you come to the 2000 era, and people are starting to realize food must change. We need to think more about organic, fewer toxins. Is it local? Is it sustainable? All these things. And of course, things like, what is the role of meat? What is the role of fish? When should you be eating these things? And where should you be getting them? And I think actually the next part of this sequence is to appreciate that not only is it about exercise, not only is it about food, but it is also about stress reduction. It is also about living a good life. And this is something, of course, that the Ayurvedic physicians told us thousands of years ago. The traditional Chinese physicians told us thousands of years ago. And we've ignored that part to our own detriment. So I think that this has to be more of a part of our prescriptive lifestyle.
I couldn't agree more. In my book, I delineate 4 things that we can do to up our serotonin to try to achieve happiness. But in the process, we also tamp down our dopamine in order to, shall we say, keep pleasure special, as opposed to the constant, whir of it, which actually makes it not pleasurable at all. I call them the 4 C's.
Okay.
The first one, connect. And Facebook is not connection. Get off knowledge. Fact is, connection actually means interpersonal, eye-to-eye, face-to-face,
Right.
like we are doing now. Because we have this set of neurons in the back here called mirror neurons that actually read facial expressions of the person you're talking to in real time, and you end up adopting many of the emotions that that person is transmitting with those. I'm sure you're familiar with Paul Ekman, also a UC scientist at Berkeley, who basically showed that virtually every culture on the planet, unrelated to each other, all manifest the same facial expressions for the same emotions, irrespective of the language. This is baked in. This is, and so we have neurons that are baked in that read that, and so that is, we have a name for this process. It's called empathy.
Right.
And if you don't generate empathy, you don't generate happiness. And we have a huge number of people, some in high positions, who are incapable of generating empathy.
Right.
And that should be a lesson to us all. The second one is contribute. Contribute. Okay. That does not mean to your IRA.
Yeah. Okay.
It's got to be to outside of yourself. It's it can't be to your bank book. It's got to be to society at large, or your friends, your family. People want to know this work contribution. The answer is it can be if you recognize how your work helps others, and your boss does too. Okay. Now, we work for major medical schools. Right. Sometimes that's not clear.
Okay. So connect, contribute. All right.
Number 3, cope, which of course is stress reduction, as we just talked about. And number 4 is cook. And the reason is that for me, there are 3 things in food that matter in terms of serotonin generation. One is, two of them are positive and one is negative. And the 2 that are positive are tryptophan, the precursor, which is the rarest amino acid, hardest to find. Really only eggs, poultry, and some fish. And those are not composed of processed food for the most part. Omega-3 fatty acids, which again are from marine life, but usually wild marine life rather than farmed. And flax, again, not really part of processed food. And then a reduction in the amount of fructose, sugar, which of course is all of processed food. So real food works and processed food doesn't. And of course, real food works for you as well.
And how much do you push people to go toward the food sources, whether it be for omega-3s, for probiotics, for prebiotics? How much do you say, okay, it's just as good to take some DHA as a capsule, for example, or how much do you worry about that being oxidized and not being as good as having it in the food?
Right. So the Iowa Women's Study looked at all of these dietary supplements, and the only single dietary supplement that they could actually show did what it was supposed to was iron.
Wow.
Everything else, not so much. Now, it did matter if you got it in food. So there may be some differences in terms of absorption, that where real food allows for that. And now, of course, some food is actually bred to not have so many of those, to up the sweetness, and in the process, some of the vitamins and minerals go down. So that can be potentially problematic. But the studies say that taking these supplements don't work like the nutraceutical industry says so.
Interesting.
So I'm not sure I'm on board with the supplement story just yet.
So one of the things I was fascinated by in your earlier book, Fat Chance, was if you look at the profile of our patients with cognitive decline, we tell them get your cognoscopy when you turn 45, especially if there's any family history, especially if you've got any symptoms, any of those things, or if you're concerned. And you can see the profiles for the type 1, the inflammatory, the trophic type, or the toxic type. But what intrigued me is many of these same sorts of biochemical changes are things that you're seeing in much younger people who do not have Alzheimer's, at least at that time, but obviously are increasing their risk. So the question is, should we be telling people maybe don't wait until you're 45? When should people know about these sorts of biochemical parameters?
Absolutely. So the question is, does metabolic syndrome in children lead to brain changes? That's the question.
Right.
The answer is we don't know for sure, but they certainly correlate. So Antonio Convey from NYU has done some very nice neuroimaging studies showing hippocampal dysfunction and smaller volumes and other parts like prefrontal cortex being decreased in adolescents who have metabolic syndrome. So whether the abnormality preceded the metabolic problem, the brain abnormality preceded the metabolic problem, or whether the metabolic problem preceded the brain abnormality, or one thing caused both of them, separately, correlation is not causation.
Right.
And it's pretty hard to do those studies, as you know.
Right.
We're sort of in the same boat. Trying to deal with chronic diseases and trying to infer causation from various epidemiologic and prospective correlational studies. And it's hard.
Right.
I recognize that, and I know you do too. But you got to go where the data sends you. And right now, we're seeing changes in the brain that are consistent with cognitive decline in adolescence.
Wow, that is scary.
It is. It's
real,
very scary.
real concern.
Yeah.
Do you have long-term data on these patients to see what happens to them as they go along?
I don't. I wish I did. It'd be a really good thing to know. We have epidemiologic data that says that many of these patients go on to develop metabolic syndrome, chronic metabolic disease, addiction, depression.
Right.
I don't know that any of those studies have gone on long enough to determine cognitive decline per se.
Right.
But we do know that insulin resistance is, again, at the basis of metabolic syndrome. We also know that insulin resistance is at the basis of this phenomenon we call dementia. So we're, then the question is, well, what causes the insulin resistance? And most people would say, well, obesity does. But the fact is, thin people get all of these diseases too.
Right. And certainly at the other end of the age spectrum, there's no question that people who have metabolic syndrome are at much greater risk for cognitive decline associated with Alzheimer's disease. So certainly, if you connect the dots, it's suspicious, at the very least. Yeah. So you've gone, I think, in a very interesting way from the biochemistry, the fat chance of the earlier book, to now the psychology and the neurobiology, the hacking side of things. And yet,
well, that's the hacking part is the politics.
Yes, exactly. You've gone, well, and certainly there's some psychology to that.
Yes.
In fact, I think what you're actually showing is that to some extent, let's say the biochemistry of the politicians and the food processors and the pharma industry is ahead of the biochemistry that we're teaching our students. As one leading professor told me, we know what we're teaching our students is lies, but they believe our lies,
right.
which is worrisome in this day and age.
Well, I don't know. You went to medical school at Duke, right?
I did.
Okay. I went to medical school at Cornell, and I will tell you, the first day, the first meeting, September 1st, 1976, we were told, and I never forgot this, 50% of what we teach you is wrong. We just don't know which 50%. Right? Kind of the same thing. The problem is that there are a lot of people who were in that room who forgot that. Right? And they think that what they learned back then is still true. And it's only when you do the research and you push the envelope that you recognize, hey, everything I learned is not true.
Right.
And I think what makes me the most upset is the fact that I went to undergrad at MIT, and I studied nutrition and food science. I got a degree in nutrition and food science.
Oh.
And then I went to medical school, and they beat it out of me.
Right.
And they told me a calorie was a calorie, and it was only about the calories, and it was about chronic disease, and diet played no role in it, and it was not important, and lower your cholesterol. That's all they said, was lower your cholesterol. And, of course, eliminate saturated fat. And actually, at that point, it was eliminate all fat, which turned out to be not only wrong, but, in fact, a put-up job. We now have the paper trail to show that that was actually the Sugar Research Foundation paying off 2 Harvard School of Public Health scientists to exonerate sugar and figure saturated fat as a bad guy. It was so we've based 40 to 50 years of diet advice in this country on a fraud. It's that simple. So we did that. I mean, these are my colleagues at UCSF who dug that out.
Right. So recently, I was talking to one official who said to me, "Well, we can't teach any of this in a medical school until it's generally accepted by all doctors. And of course, it won't be generally accepted by all doctors until we teach it in medical school."
Exactly right.
So how do we change the behavior? How do we move forward? And in an analogous situation, people, the patients themselves will say, well, how do I change my behavior? How do I do this? You're telling me that it's not good enough just to take a prescription. Now I need to actually make changes in my diet, my exercise, my lifestyle. How do we get people to do that?
Exactly. We're doing it right now, actually. This is part of it. Ultimately, you have to educate the educators. Agreed. So my goal for the next 3.5 years is to ally the medical, the dental, and the dietary professions to speak with one voice about the role of food processing. I will tell you, a lot of doctors get it.
Yeah.
Not all. In fact, the ones who don't get it are the ones whose grants depend on it being the old way.
Right.
The dentists are totally on board. It's off the charts. I mean, remember, they were the original anti-sugar advocates.
Right.
So the dentists are absolutely, almost virtually in lockstep.
Right.
It's the dietitians who I think feel the most threatened.
Right.
Because, they've made their living for decades now on this concept of calories, because they count calories, because everyone can do the math.
Right.
Not everyone can do the science.
Right.
And I'm very concerned, and I think that this will continue to be a scandal.
The other thing that comes up, as you know, with the patients is, why isn't my insurance company behind this? Why am I not getting these things? If you're telling me I need these additional tests, if you're telling me I need to change these things, why is it that this is difficult for me, for my wallet? Why is it that my company, I'm paying this insurance company each month, why aren't they helping me?
Right. Well, in fact, every every employer is paying $2,750 per employee per year for obesity-related disease, whether that employee is obese or not. Okay? And the thing is that the insurance companies used to love this. And the reason was because it was the casino model. Pay to play and set the rates. But Obamacare, and I don't care what you think of Obamacare or not, that's not the issue. Obamacare did one thing. It capped insurers at 15% profit. So all of a sudden, they're not making money off you being sick, and so that they can raise the premiums. Right. And that's why you saw 3 insurers, United, Aetna, Humana, opt out of the exchanges, because they can't keep making the money off this, because they're capped. So all of a sudden, for the first time, insurers actually want you to be healthy. But they don't know how, because they've never done it before. So I'm actually working with insurance companies to try to sort of reset their model.
Interesting. Okay. And then how do you get the doctors to say, okay, we are dealing with these complex chronic illnesses, so we're going to have to take a little more time. Maybe a computer and expert systems become a much larger part of this analysis. We're going to have to look at a larger data set, but we're going to get new subtypes that we never understood before. We're going to get a new view of disease that we never understood. But we're going to have to do several things. This is essentially the era of the beginning of the era of programmatics rather than monotherapeutics.
Sure.
How do we
Personalized
get people to
medicine.
change that? Exactly.
This is obviously a big deal here at UCSF, and it's a big deal actually pretty much at every medical school now, is how to do this. And the issue is that you have to have empiric data on the patients before they get sick,
Right.
in order to help you figure out which pathway they took, and therefore being able to determine what the cause is, and therefore how to solve it. The problem is treating the result doesn't work. The horse is out of the barn.
Right.
You have to treat the cause. And of course, your recode is attempting to treat all the causes all at once, because on any given patient you may not know what the individual cause was. And I understand that, and I applaud you for being able to assemble all of these things. But ultimately, we want to be able to get to that nugget of figuring out what is the historical factor, or what is the family marker, or what is the biomarker that's going to tell us which way one person went in terms of disease, and also which therapeutic will work best. And that is a hell of a nut to crack.
Right, yeah, and what contributors. And certainly for many of these illnesses, there's likely to be more than one contributor, and certainly we see that with cognitive decline. To some extent, I think what you're saying is we need to move medicine a decade or two earlier, so that instead of waiting for the symptoms worked fairly well for pneumococcal pneumonia, fairly well, as long as you had your antibiotic ready, but it is not working. It has not worked very well for complex chronic illnesses. The good news is we should all be getting checked when we're completely asymptomatic, or at least we think we are,
Yes.
and uncovering these various biomarkers, et cetera, so that you can then prevent these problems. The reality is dementia, metabolic syndrome, these should all be rare conditions.
And they used to be.
Yeah, very good point. They used to be. Absolutely.
And that's the point. And that is the point. The fact is, prevention is not taught in medical school.
Right.
Period.
Right.
Okay? And part of the reason prevention is not taught in medical school is because, number one, nutrition is complex. Number two, big pharma pays the bills. And so, we have focused on treatment. You focused on treatment. I focused on treatment for me, at least, for the first 25 years of my practice.
Right.
And it wasn't working.
Right.
And so I started doing the research and came to the realization of what it was that indeed I and everyone else was doing wrong. And now I feel very differently about the phenomenon. I feel very differently about what chronic disease means and what our food supply does to contribute to that, as do you.
This is a really good point. And one of the trends that we're seeing is that more and more people are now coming in and saying, I have Alzheimer's in my family, or I'm concerned about it, or I'm the age, and I would like you to work with me and make sure I don't ever get dementia. And that's the best thing we can hear. Fantastic, because there's a tremendous amount we can do. Despite what has been claimed in the past, there's a tremendous amount, and that's clear now from the finger study and from other studies as well. It's clear that there's a lot that can be done ahead of time. As you say, prevention, and this is personalized prevention. And in fact, when you look at the various risk factors, these people typically have several that are suboptimal. Great, they can all be addressed, and these people do very, very well. When they come in and they begin to be symptomatic, you can also do very well. It's when they come in down here and they're very late in the process that is so much more difficult. So we tell everybody, please come in as early as possible, and preferentially for prevention.
Before we started, we were talking about the fact that beta cells, the cells in the pancreas, are really neurons. They just don't have axons, but they function in the same way. All neurosecretory cells basically have the same machinery. And what patients with diabetes are told is, well, diabetes is this chronic, degenerative, unrelenting, unremitting disease that is progressive and will ultimately kill you. And that's just not true. By the way, I should qualify that. I'm talking about type 2 diabetes.
Right.
Yes, type 2 diabetes. That's just not true. In fact, many people are able to reverse their diabetes. They are certainly able to reverse their prediabetes. And we see this now consistently, depending on what they do, both in terms of the specifics of their diet, not just eat less. That never worked. And also, of course, their exercise capacity. And, of course, avoiding various toxins in our environment. The problem is that the longer you wait, the harder it is to reverse. And so these people who are basically given, sulfonylureas or, GLP-1 analogs or, various, or insulin itself, are basically not getting the information they need to be able to reverse their problem. Right. The longer they go, the harder it will be. Right. So this information has to get out sooner rather than later.
And what happens when people are bouncing? So one of the things that we've seen is you say, okay, this is a complex chronic illness. There are these many contributors. We need to start addressing these. Then they go to another doctor who says, no, that's absolutely wrong. We're looking for the monotherapy. You need to be on your drug and get off the program. So how do you convince people that, in fact, this is the change? This is it, because it's hard for people to say, wait a minute, you're telling me that my doctor isn't up with the latest?
Oh, there's a paper. Everyone can access it. It's from the National Bureau of Economic Research. It's online, and the title of this paper is "Does Science Advance One Funeral at a Time?"
Yeah, this is from Planck, the original.
That's right.
Planck.
Max Planck, Max Planck. Famous quote.
Physics, yeah.
So a group from the NBER did an empiric analysis of whether or not Max Planck's statement was true.
Yeah.
And so what they did, which I found this fascinating, what they did was they took all the members of the Institute of Medicine and the National Academy of Sciences, and they made a database for each one of them. And they also made a database for every co-author that they'd ever published a paper with. And then they followed that 20 years. And what they did was they looked to see whenever the guru, the IOM or NAS member, died, what happened to the co-author's productivity. It turned out they all fell off a cliff as soon as the honcho died.
Okay.
And so then they used mesh terms to figure out, well, who else was now publishing in that space? And it turned out it was a completely new set of people with a completely new set of ideas.
Interesting.
In other words, that higher up was holding the field hostage for the length of their lives. And indeed, science does advance one funeral at a time. Well, guess what? The honchos are dying.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, this is a new century, and here we are already 17 years into it, and still 20th century medicine is the prevailing medicine in most places.
So we're starting to see a little bit of change.
Right. So tell me a little bit about your goals for the next years of your career. You talked a little bit about the next 3.5 years. What's your goal in terms of this is what I'd like to see during the remainder of my career in medicine?
Well, so I've sort of staked a claim to the idea that our food supply is killing us.
Yeah.
Our processed food supply. Now, I will tell you, there isn't enough land to grow real food for everybody. In fact, we will need 4 Central Valleys of California by the year 2050, and we won't even have one because of the soil erosion, the runoff, the global warming, etc. Okay, we basically, obesity will probably, and this is really, really dark, but obesity may take care of itself because we may end up with famine instead.
Oh, that's a concern.
Well, that's how nature works.
And how do you get the importance of this to Congress, to the President of the United States, to the food companies, to the corporations, to the pharmaceutical companies? How do you get people to sit up and take note of this important future?
Well, I'm going to tell you that Washington is completely co-opted. And the reason they're co-opted is because they're paid off to be. And there are specific organizations, political action committees, et cetera, which I will not mention, but if anybody wants to email me, I'll try to put that out elsewhere. But the fact of the matter is, this has to come from the food industry itself. So what my goal is to help the industry recreate itself, to develop a new food industry business model, which rewards them for doing the right thing instead of doing the wrong thing. Right now, they're rewarded for doing the wrong thing. Could they be rewarded for doing the right thing? The answer is absolutely, but not with the current business model.
Right. So, of course, Buckminster Fuller said, create a new model.
That's right.
That makes the old model obsolete. So maybe you need an Uber type of new food type company. So it's interesting to me, Al Gore is trying to save the planet, and that's fantastic. But we need to save the people on the planet as well.
Well, to be honest with you, when we do one, we will do the other. They are inexorably tied because 40% of climate change is agriculture.
What about all the fish farms and all those sorts of things that are being touted as the way of the future? Is this a healthy way of the future, or is this another incorrect path?
Well, if the oceans keep getting hotter, I can't see that we're going to be able to have viable fish farms for very long. This is an existential crisis. The issue of pleasure versus happiness, the cell phone versus reading a book.
Yeah.
These are actually existential crises, not just befalling America, but all of the human race. And our food supply is sort of a manifestation of all of these. Unfortunately, climate change is sort of the ultimate outcome variable. And we have to start working at this, as we talked about before, way upstream.
Right.
And, when we figure out what's good for this, we will also be figuring out what's good for cognitive decline, because they will ultimately be the same.
So, in the midst of the crises that you've mentioned, I think we should probably both mention there's a lot of great news. We should, end, I think, on a very positive note. For the first time, we are now seeing that complex chronic illnesses are assailable medically, whether you're talking about dementia, whether you're talking about type 2 diabetes, and ultimately the same sorts of things are going to happen with Parkinson's, with Lou Gehrig's disease. Things that we have all been taught were impossible are now becoming possible. So I think that is the real positive for people. These diseases, these complex chronic diseases, should actually be rare conditions.
They should, and again, they were.
As you said, they were. Yeah.
The problem is that everyone views these chronic metabolic diseases as your own fault.
Right.
Yeah. Okay? And they are not. They are a manifestation of our new environment.
Right.
They are a public health issue. The problem is we are not dealing with it as a public health issue. Right. I just wrote an editorial about soda taxes for Canada's Globe and Mail, and a very cogent argument. And I will tell you, the people who wrote back, in the comments section, it's like, I don't care what you say, get your hands off my soda.
Right.
It's that kind of sloganism, it's that kind of, sort of propagation of propaganda that, will, be our undoing. Let's stick to the science.
It's a good point. Public health played a huge role in the major medical success of the 20th century, which was against infectious illnesses. A huge role for public health. So the hope is that there will be an analogous role for public health in complex chronic illnesses in the 21st century. And I think that's a very exciting possibility.
Well, the World Health Organization declared war on non-communicable diseases, or NCDs. The fact is, every country recognizes the problem, and many countries' medical establishments are going bankrupt because of them. Right. Yet, we can't even do the one or two simple things we know to do to fix it because of corporate pressure.
Yeah.
So that's why corporations have hacked us.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Well, I look forward, as I said, I really enjoyed Fat Chance. I have not had a chance to read The Hacking of the American Mind. I look forward to it very much.
Oh.
And Dr. Robert Lustig, thank you very much for your time, and thanks for all the great work you're doing to change the world for all of us. Thank you.
And Dr. Dale Bredesen,
Thank
what
you.
can I say?
Thank you.
You're bringing a new light onto a very dark field. So
Absolutely.
I
Yeah.
congratulate you.
Thanks very much. Great to talk to you.
You too.